Treasurer Mark Gordon, welcome to the Star-Tribune.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks.
Good to have you back.
Yeah.
Well, let's go right into it, and you only have one opponent. How do you differentiate yourself to the voters?
Well, I guess I would just ask the voters to take a look at what I've been doing, and hopefully, as we go through this interview, talk a little bit about what's coming. I have not had the opportunity to meet my opponent. The one opportunity I would have had, unfortunately, my partner in a ranch up in KC, John Schiffer, passed away, and I wasn't able to get down to the Pine Bluff social event, Pie Social. But just to talk about what I've been up to, Joe Meyer passed away. There was a little bit of work that was piling up behind him. Joe was a great treasure for the state of Wyoming and a personal friend, but he had been ill, and it took a little bit of time to kind of catch up to what we were doing. One of the big concerns I had when we started was what was going to happen with central bank activity, what was our fixed income portfolio. Anybody who's living on fixed income knows that the Federal Reserve's policies have depressed the returns that fixed income can give you. And there was a lot of concern at that time that we might see a change in rates that would affect that as well. You can actually imagine the concern that Wyoming has, because all of our funds, with the exception of the permanent funds and the pension funds, are by constitution required to be in fixed income. So we took as an office a very, we call it a blank sheet approach. We started from the ground up. What would happen if inflation were in play? What would happen if we had rising rates in the central bank? What would happen if we had deflation? We restructured the portfolio. That gave us a $900 and some million return, $300 million more than we'd ever had before last year. We continued on through that process with investments to look at the equity review and for the permanent funds, and then we just sort of, I guess, did what our office does well, tried to make sure that we had a good, solid asset allocation in place. And again, this year, we had over $800 million in revenue for the state. That makes us the second most important revenue source for the state, and the most reliable, arguably, and that's the position that I take very seriously. But in addition to that, I put about 70,000 miles on my, well, it's actually Joe's car, but my state car, getting around to Yoder, to Torrington, to Burlington, to Cody, to virtually every place I could think of in the state, Evanston, Kemmer, just to understand the needs, because as you know, part of the responsibility we have on those boards is intelligence service on the State Loan and Investment Board. Obviously been here to Casper a couple of times. So I've really enjoyed that, getting to know the needs of various communities, large and small. As you know, I grew up in KC, so it's a small community. So I've enjoyed that, and then also working with Governor Meade, and very concerned about what's happening in Washington about our coal industry. Went out to Washington in early March and met with labor, with community leaders, with business groups in Longview, Washington, with an eye towards sort of bringing a more reasoned approach to how we get our coal exports moving offshore, and continuing with that effort. Actually, you may know that in my background, I was the chair of the Environmental Quality Council, and one of the things I'm hoping to additionally do on that front is to be able to meet with the regulatory counterpart in Washington and just kind of walk through what the thinking they are going to bring to their environmental review of that project. So that, and then also went back to Washington, met with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there to remind them that timely permitting of our uranium facilities is a good thing for Wyoming. that occasioned a change, or actually occasioned a quick permit for Your Honors, which is a Casper-based uranium company. So those things were all part of the job, but in addition to that, and sort of finally sort of wrapping up on some of the other stuff we've done, when I got to, and I think we did talk about this at one point a little bit earlier, when I got to the office, there were three projects that were going to use a unique capacity of the state to help fund them. And there were two uranium projects and a hotel. I was very concerned that the way the state was approaching prosecuting those was a very ad hoc basis, and I wanted to make sure we had a much more solid business-minded approach. We ultimately put those rules in place. We just had another set of comments, and I think our comment period's closed on what are called the Industrial Revenue Development Bonds. And they're now going to the governor and the management committee and should be released in final form very quickly. But because of the work we did there, the legislature last year looked again at Amendment 4. Amendment 4 was passed back in the 80s. It's now Article 12 of the Constitution. The Amendment 4 monies were monies that were to be taken out of the general fund by 2/3 vote of each house and placed into a revolving loan fund to be used for economic development. The impetus for this was obviously Cody Lab, but we wanted to make sure that the program had solid business principles, that it wasn't aimed at any particular industry, that it would be available for all industries to take advantage of, and so those we have we've issued emergency rules. So again, make sure that when people apply, they know what they're being asked. We're awaiting our first application. So that's kind of a snapshot of how busy I've been. When I look at the next 4 years, there are a couple things that I really want to do. One of them is because states and counties have, just like anybody who's living on fixed income, any retiree, been living with a reduced return on their investments, we're trying to do whatever we can to help counties, cities, governmental subdivisions, everything from Natrona County down to Powell or Worland. I think both have aquatic centers they've built trust funds for. And we're trying to move the agenda so they can get a better return on the monies they've set aside there. So working very hard on doing that. A little bit outside the Treasurer's office, but nonetheless, what we're doing is we're setting up a parallel, setting up a fund which won't be under our purview, but will mirror exactly what the state's asset allocation is. And because we're sizable, we're now 57th in the world by the Sovereign Wealth Institute thinking. Because we're sizable, we can push the fees down. So hopefully counties and cities will have the benefit of reduced fees and better returns. And the last thing, and the thing that I'm really pushing very hard on, and I have had great conversations with Chairman Harshman for the Joint Appropriations Committee and others, Drew Perkins, Senator Perkins, is the notion of taking right now, if you look at the rainy day fund, which is much in the news, there's about $1.8 billion that's set aside in the rainy day fund. And that constitutional requirement we talked about requires that money be invested in what we call the state agency pool. That has to be invested in fixed income assets. So it has not got that great a return. If we can put the legislative pieces in place that allow us to go for a constitutional amendment, for what I guess I'm terming a constitutional fund, like the permanent funds, that will allow us to take that rainy day account, build a mechanism to put them in a constitutionally appropriate fund that will allow us to to invest more broadly, just the way we do with permanent funds, we'll get a much better return. And that would be good for states. And in other words, we'd be taking that savings and we'd be making more out of it. So that's, I guess, kind of a long-winded way of telling you what I've been up to and what I'd like to do.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that. So, of course, that would open it up to more investing options, but that potentially we're talking about greater risk then as well. Right?
Of course, yeah.
Is that a concern for you? I mean, the whole idea of having that money there is that it stays there.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So let me make it, our Constitution right now allows us to, in the permanent funds, those are permanent funds, they're sacred, and then the pension fund also is allowed to go out for a little bit higher return. When you look at what we're looking at, when you look at what we're trying to do with this constitutional fund, we're trying to make sure that we're prudently investing it across a wide spectrum of asset classes. Because right now, largely because of central bank activity, not just the Federal Reserve, but the Bank of Japan and the ECB, the European Common Bank, all of those rates are going to be depressed. Now, when interest rates increase in bonds, if you hold a long-term bond that has a depressed, expectation of return on it, you can't sell it when that interest rate changes. So, prudence would dictate if you really want to do as good a job and keep less risky, you would have that broad asset allocation that would have a sensible, and again, I stress very sensible allocation to equities. So and that's one of the reasons I've been looking at this with help of the various legislators, is because I think what they can do statutorily is they can say, we don't want you to go any further than, let's say, 50% equity. That's what they do with the permanent funds at this point. They kind of set the notion that equities are more risky because you can lose money with equities. So we don't want you to go any further out than that. So I'm expecting that the legislature would exercise their appropriate authority and say, this is the amount of risk we think we can tolerate you taking. But then beyond that, and just as we do with the permanent funds, having guidelines that say, no derivatives, no currency exchanges, none of the sort of fancy stuff that we got into, when we got into the 2008 collapse.
So you talked about a range of initiatives here and also a range of things that you do. What do you consider the most important thing that you do?
By far the most important thing that I do is to be accessible for the people of Wyoming, and I take that really quite seriously. So, and I know that seems like a little bit of a strange answer, but obviously the return to the state and our management of those funds is extremely critical. But for the communities of the state, for the people, the oil and gas, if they've got leases on state lands, that's incredibly important. If ranchers are grazing, if we have recreational needs, as a member of the State Board of Land Commissioners, the State Loan and Investment Board, you have to have a wide range of perspective and the ability to be accessible at all times.
Speaking of being accessible, so you definitely had a say on the state treasurer having an office in the state capitol.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that's important?
Well, I think it's really important because when the legislature is in session, there's a kind of a deliberate process that brings legislation to the session. But then people start adding amendments or drafting or redrafting or changing bills, and that's all done in a fairly quick fashion. And one of the problems, having been there now a year and a half, I can tell you with the lottery bill, with the Amendment 4, what we call the Large Project Fund bill, with the industrial revenue development bonds. I know the auditors had similar things, and the Secretary of State's had similar things. To be in the Capitol, so when the legislator has a bill and they want to come down and talk to you about it, you're there. And as a result, I think we get a better product for the state. I think it also measures government in the sense that you have that checks and balances. You have the executive, and then you also have the legislative. One of the big concerns that I have is that, and you know, I don't know if the legislature either consciously or unconsciously is really contemplating this, but they've become very much more active about government than they have been before, and it's very important that we recognize that we have an executive and a legislative and a judicial branch. If we're moved out of the building, not only is our access not as easily, we're not as accessible to the legislators, but there is a temptation to sort of start thinking of us more as agencies than as executives. That's all of those things from a parent standpoint and also from a practical standpoint tell me that it's very important we have a place in the Capitol. And that's one reason why I've fought as hard as I have for it. But beyond that, and that's really from a, you know, here we are in Cheyenne and we've got to run government, and how are we going to do that, which is, you know, kind of that Cheyenne centric point of view. I come from KC. Cheyenne and KC haven't always gotten along, so I'm very, I guess, sensitive to how people around the state feel. And in that case, you know, just like when I first went down there, of course you want to see all your electeds in that building. That's where government's done. I don't, you know, I'm more anxious to know that I can walk in and see my treasurer, my auditor, my secretary of state. It's not very far over to the superintendents, and I don't think the superintendent's been there for quite a while, so maybe that's just a difference of me. And my governor. So frankly, during the course of the year, we have a lot of visitors for the State Loan and Investment Board, where we're dealing with, you know, community projects or whatever comes down the pike that way. You know, commissioners can come down, or concerned citizens can come down, and they can walk through the Capitol and see all of us quite easily. I think it's nice to talk about how we want to, excuse me, let me put it a little bit differently. It's nice to talk about, well, we're moving you out, but we're going to give you fabulous new offices. But I don't think any of us really want fabulous new offices. We all have jobs in the Capitol. We like doing that. Yeah, and then the conversation sort of changes to, well, we'll give you ceremonial offices. But that's a very different notion from having a capital office, and we look at it as a capital office. So finally, as I think I've said before, the biggest concern I have for the people of Wyoming is, do you want that building to be your house, your house of government that houses all the important functions of government and the executive and legislative branch? Or do you want it to become a legislative house filled with legislators, lawyers, and lobbyists? That's pretty much the way I look at it.
So besides the State Loan Investment Board, what would you consider is the most important or powerful board that you sit on, and why?
Well, the Board of Land Commissioners is obviously an incredibly important board, more so as we see mineral development proceed. It's important because, first off, it governs how the state can manage its own natural resources. And it's important from the perspective of resolving issues like access and you know, when we have mineral development, how does that affect the surface owner? How does that affect the state overall in terms of return to the state? But I think it's also very important. And this is something else that I've tried to bring to this conversation in my time there. It also, we can participate with our lessees, be they oil and gas, or be they surface owners, or be they special use lessees, to try to make sure that as we develop our resources, we develop them with the greatest sensitivity and care towards the best beneficial use down the road. And I think that's that's a slightly new effort for the State Board of Land Commissioners.
Talk to me about the coal ports. When you went out to see the lay of the land there, what did you hear, and what surprised you?
Well, I think I was a little bit surprised arriving there. Longview is a brownfield site. It turns out my stepbrother managed the Weyerhaeuser properties that are right next to it. The Longview Millennium Terminal sits on the side of an old aluminum smelter that was built, I think, in 6 months in 1942. We're now, a year and a half, maybe 2 years in. It's been cleaned up and all that sort of stuff, and we haven't even gotten through scoping. What really surprised me was how important and influential politics are getting to be around the country. So Longview is a community with a rich industrial history. It already has rail transport that's in place. It already has the Weyerhaeuser facilities. It already has, it actually already imports alumina through the same port, so there's barges coming and unloading and loading there. And you have a community that fully understands and appreciates and wants to have that development. They care about their community and they like the jobs. But they're stymied in that effort by King County, which is Seattle. And there, because of a very strong environmental local community vote that decided the governor's race, that one county swung the way industrial development in Washington is going to go, to the point where Longview, which does have, as I say, they have this rail capacity, and one of the big arguments about let's keep coal out of Washington because we're going to have so much rail traffic, and that could be dangerous for people. I think it's incredibly ironic that Longview does have a problem with rail crossings. And they've tried to address that by saying, let's put a bridge over this. Let's have an overpass over that rail crossing. But King County wants to have their money spent in King County. They don't care about the rail crossing in Longview. So, while we don't want to have increased rail traffic because it could be dangerous, we're not going to mitigate the kind of rail traffic problem we have now by allowing for infrastructure to be built there. So I think that was the surprise to me, is how sort of misaligned states are becoming, and how the political process in some of those states is very troubling.
The last question I have is maybe kind of a weird technical one to end on, but it matters to a lot of people. Let's talk about recapture provisions and what place you think those have.
And are you talking about school funding?
I'm looking specifically at loans offered through SLID.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, let me first start by saying that we've had a remarkable run of economic success through the 2000s with the oil and gas boom and coal boom. The state's been flush and had a lot of money, and so we've been magnanimous and wonderfully giving about having grants. And to a certain degree, communities have come to expect grants. With what the Obama administration has done on coal, with just sort of the natural course of economic development, times ebb and flow, and I don't think we're in for any cause or any time for a cause to be worried about the future. But at the same time, I think we need to be thoughtful about how we use our funds going forward. So I do think that means that we're going to start to see more loans. And this is all a little bit new to me, as you know. I've only been here for a year and a half, but I've been sort of surprised because when you're talking about SLIB loans straight up, they're run out of the Office of State Loans and Investments, and those either have a grant component or they have a loan component, and that's pretty straightforward. When you look at some of the programs that have come out of the Business Council, it's not quite as clear. You may be talking about the recapture provisions that are going to go to the local economic development boards. And the notion there, and I support that, was that these economic development boards need to have some wherewithal to be able to attract and promote business and be able to put a little skin in the game. So I think over time, the programs were designed to allow for the recapture of those funds back into those economic development boards. All of that's good. One of the concerns that I've heard expressed by a few is that those recaptured dollars are now being used in different ways. Is it appropriate for an economic development board to own a building? And if you're in the business of owning a building, then do you have new challenges to making sure that building's occupied? What's your motivation at that point as to economic development? Are you just trying to make sure your assets used, or are you really trying to promote economic development? So there's some questions there that I think need to be sorted out, and I think will be. There are concerns at a large industrial size of things that there may be some companies that have greater expertise, or some might say are better placed to be able to get the fruits of those efforts. And I think that's a concern, and I think we need to make sure that as these funds are recaptured by the economic development agencies, that they are fully used for economic development in the communities. Now that's all separate from the loan process, which I guess when I arrived, I kind of thought it would be like we had talked about. There's grants and there's loans. But for the Business Council, it's a little bit different. And the nice thing to see is the focus that's been brought on that, I think, is going to bring a new discipline to how the loans are prosecuted, so that they truly will be loans. And my hope is the legislature, rather than just reacting, and this is one of the great things about having an executive branch and a legislative branch, is that the executive can look at it maybe a little bit differently. But I do hope that rather than just reacting and saying, okay, we're going to write new pieces of legislation so that we only can do this, that we look at how we can best leverage the whole spectrum of the program for the best benefit. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the new loan program will look like. And I do hope that we continue to have those recapture provisions, because I think it's really important. Casper, Cheyenne, both have done very, very well. Again, Forward Cody's done well. Sheridan's done well. For smaller communities in the basin, it's a little longer. They're less far along on their maturation, and they it's got a little bit more of a pull. And for them, it's really critical to have some of that money coming back.
Well, so let me give you, we've got a few minutes left, so
sure.
We need a chance to make a closing statement. And I'd like you to frame it this way: why should I vote for you?
Well, first off, as I began, I said, I've finally caught up to speed on what we're doing here. I've really enjoyed the office. I think I've brought a great deal of value to the office. We're making enormous strides on how we manage transparency and want to work on unclaimed property, get it working a little bit better. So I have to have that background. So the first step in why you should vote for me is because now I have a background in this that will be carried forward in the next 4 years. The next step is that I do believe that the initiatives I've talked about here the one for local governments and the one about making better use of our rainy day fund, are going to take committed leadership. I think if you look at my experience on both the Industrial Revenue Development Bonds program and on the large project funds, you'll see that leadership carried through. And I think we have a very bright future for that. My broad background in oil and gas, having worked for Apache in agriculture, been in that all my life, in small business, having a movie theater in Buffalo and having grown a catalog business in the 80s when we had the last economic downturn, having had a bookshop. All of that, plus my background with the Environmental Quality Council, and just sort of broad-based experience across topics from sage grouse to how you fix a truck, I think is a particularly important aspect to anybody serving on these boards. I have a familiarity with small towns and large towns. So all of those things I think help me to position the state for truly good economic times as we go forward. And the last thing I'd say is that I think you need to have somebody with my experience, and at this point, and I really hate talking about it this way because I grew up on a ranch and you never brag, but the fact of the matter is that I have respect at this point, and respect enough to be able to transition our office. And I say that very importantly. We're number, and I mentioned it before, we're number 57 in the world, sovereign wealth fund. We're 18.6 billion, actually almost pushing 17 billion on our market value, or 19 billion on our market value. That's serious money, and we grow about $1 billion a year. You look at that back in 1968. Stan Hathaway was told by Minnie Mitchell that there were $83 in our checking account. We know that we have to buffer against policies at a federal level. We have to shepherd those resources as we go forward. And my staff has been grown over 3 great treasurers: Stan Smith, Cynthia Lummis, and Joe Meyer. They're all at or around 60 years old. So we don't want to have everybody retire and then just try to find new people. We need to make sure that we have a transition period, an overlap, a training, and that's something I think with my respect and the ability to work with the legislature and other executives that we'll be able to get that transition through and forward without growing government, but at the same time understanding that it's going to take a little bit of time to get that process worked through.
Thanks, Mark, for coming in. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very, very much.